is American pressure. It's a signal that greater American pressure on Russia, also manifested by the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth at the NATO meeting this week, when he said that, if Russia wasn't interested in making peace, US would give Ukraine more assistance, more weapons, a much tougher line coming from the Pentagon, coming from the White House. That pressure is what is now making Putin sound more conciliatory. So
today on our program, we are joined by Shea, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security and Defense at France of Europe and former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Welcome to our studio.
Good morning, Sofia, and thanks for having me back on the program.
In just yesterday, Donald Trump spoke with Vladimir Putin just a day before his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in Washington. Why now? What do you think prompted this timing?
Well, it seems, Sofia, that it was Putin and not Trump who initiated the call. But clearly, from Putin's perspective, he's worried about the prospect of Trump agreeing to give the Ukrainians the Tomahawk cruise missiles, which he knows, if they're delivered quickly and if they're delivered in sufficient quantity, could inflict enormous damage on Russia's military infrastructure, particularly the ports, the oil refineries, the transportation hubs used by the Russian military, and of course also going after the Russian drone factories, which would be very important for Ukraine, but which are sometimes, hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers from the Ukrainian border. So I think that's, of course, what is motivating Putin, and Putin will use, as always, the mixture of sort of threats and carrots to try to dissuade Trump from agreeing to provide these Tomahawks, as well as the $90 billion armaments package which President Zelensky is hoping to secure from Trump and the US at his meeting with Trump in the White House later today on Friday. So I think Putin's motivation is pretty evident and clear. He's going to say that this will be terrible for the future of US-Russia relations. He will sort of hint at escalation. And at the same time, the carrot, as always, with Putin is to try to sort of dangle the prospect of big trade deals, commercial deals after the conflict that will allow US companies to return to the Russian market, particularly ExxonMobil, particularly in the energy sector where Russia badly needs US technology and investment. What Trump's motivation is, Sofia? That's a little bit more complicated. It could go two ways. Either he is going to once again, after speaking to Putin, become more conciliatory towards the Russians and believe Putin's narrative, Putin's version of events, and then put pressure on Zelensky to make a compromise, which of course I think would be very bad. Or Trump believes that maybe now, with the threat of Tomahawks, with the United States taking a more pro-Zelensky position in recent days, that Trump has got now more pressure on Putin, more leverage on him than he had at the Alaska summit, and can use that pressure to get Putin to agree to a ceasefire. It could go either way. We'll just have to wait and see later on how this third meeting of Trump and Zelensky in the White House goes.
So do you believe that Tomahawks already have a real deterrent effect, even without being deployed in Ukraine? But I mean, in general, what we see now that Putin is just talking. There is no even promises to end the war.
Well, you're absolutely right. This is Putin's tactic. He's great at sort of, phoning Trump, or we saw that with the Alaska summit, sort of pretending that he's willing to make a compromise, launching a process, of sending low-level diplomats back to Istanbul for endless and meaningless talks, trying to get Trump involved in some sort of sham peace process, which plays for time and delays the United States taking significant decisions, for example, imposing more sanctions on Moscow, or getting tough on India and China. as Trump says he's doing, to stop them buying Russian oil, supplying more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, as well as more intelligence to Ukraine. So, Putin is the master of sort of, these diversion tactics at the very last minute to try to weaken Trump's resolve, and particularly in the wake of Trump's success at negotiating a ceasefire in the Middle East last week. Trump maybe believes now that he's the great peacemaker, that he can solve all of these issues, including Ukraine, and trying to convince Trump, that he can really now also achieve a result in Ukraine. But again, the Russian sincerity has always been lacking in the past. It's simply a diversionary tactic. It's what in English we would call a smokescreen. It's playing for time. What has made Putin phone Trump is American pressure. It's a signal that greater American pressure on Russia, also manifested by the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth at the NATO meeting this week, when he said that, if Russia wasn't interested in making peace, US would give Ukraine more assistance, more weapons, a much tougher line coming from the Pentagon, coming from the White House. That pressure is what is now making Putin sound more conciliatory. So let's hope that, Trump has learned that lesson and keeps up that pressure. But of course, he's got to make Putin convinced that the United States is really serious, and that's really the job of Trump over the next few days, particularly if he has this new summit with Putin now in a couple of days or weeks' time in Budapest.
And yesterday, Trump also announced plans for a second meeting with Putin, this time in Hungary, and you already mentioned about it. I would like to understand, do you think it was a spontaneous decision made from Trump, especially taking into account his recent statements and recent change of tone regards Ukraine?
Yes, I think what has happened is that now that Trump has succeeded in negotiating the ceasefire and the return of hostages in Gaza, which was, of course, not an easy thing to do. And I do believe that Trump, justifiably can take some credit for this, putting pressure on Israel, of course, to agree to the ceasefire, agree to a partial withdrawal of forces. Trump is on a roll, frankly, particularly in wanting to be a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's made it clear that, having, if you like, done, in inverted commas, done the Middle East, he's now once again turning his attention to Ukraine. He's never quit when it comes to his, I think, genuine desire to stop the killing in Ukraine, to bring about some kind of peace process. He's already had that summit, which was unfortunately not very productive, with Putin in Alaska, where Putin spent the whole time lecturing him on the history of the Cossacks, not really talking about peace. So I think Trump has the kind of confidence now that, after the Middle East, after, as Trump would say, stopping 7 other global conflicts like India, Pakistan, or Azerbaijan, Armenia, he's on a roll, and he now really has the credentials to finally get some kind of agreement in Ukraine. He claimed this week, for example, a big diplomatic victory in persuading Narendra Modi, the Indian premier, to stop buying Russian oil, although India hasn't confirmed this. But if it's true, that would be a big lever against Putin by denying him his second biggest oil market and an important source of revenue. So I think there is confidence in the White House now that, they're on a roll, they've put pressure on Putin, they've got the tomahawks, they've got all of the, if you like, the cards, to use Trump's expression, the cards on the table to get a result. But Putin is very good. He's demonstrated this over the last year. Putin is very good at talking to Trump, flattering his vanity, congratulating him on the Middle East peace process, persuading Trump that, maybe, he's willing to compromise, maybe he's serious about peace, and talking Trump out of any kind of decisive action, which then reduces support for Ukraine, reduces the pressure, and allows Putin to carry on the offensive. So I just hope, that Trump has learned that lesson, and the meeting in Budapest will not simply be a replay of the meeting of Trump and Putin in Helsinki during his first term, or the non-productive meeting in Alaska at the end of August.
It's also interesting that meeting will be held in Hungary. It's not only European Union countries, but also the countries that are bound by the Rome Statute. Now, should we expect that Hungary will become another state that openly disregard this Rome Statute?
Yes, absolutely. I do believe, that's why the Russians have agreed to Hungary because it's not applying the Rome Statute. For example, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, who's also, like Putin, been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. Benjamin Netanyahu has visited Hungary with impunity. So Putin, who is very careful when he travels outside Russia these days, will feel protected or okay in Hungary. He also, of course, knows that Orban is somebody, who always takes the Russian line. A couple of days ago, Viktor Orban even said that Ukraine was not an independent sovereign country, which is an incredible statement by an EU prime minister to be making. There's been friction, of course, between Hungary and Ukraine recently with Ukraine accusing Hungary of using drones over Ukrainian airspace. So it's not, in terms of the atmospherics or the symbolism, a place that I think the Ukrainians will be particularly comfortable about, particularly as they are not being invited. And so far, there is no indication that European leaders are going to be invited to participate. They'll have to try, as they did by going to Washington back in August, to try at least to have some kind of voice at the table in support of Ukraine. So certainly I think, the Europeans would have preferred somewhere like Geneva, a more traditional location for old style, Cold War, East-West diplomacy, a more neutral territory, more linked like Geneva is to the United Nations and to international law or international legality. So certainly, as I've said, not ideal, but it's not always, Sofia, the location or the symbolism that counts. It's the substance of the meeting. And if this meeting is in Hungary but still produces pressure on Russia towards peace, then I think historians will not complain too much about Budapest.
Today, Axios reports that this meeting, this call between Trump and Putin was unexpected for Ukrainian president, who actually just landed yesterday in Washington. Do you see this phone call as kind of cold shower, especially for Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government, after weeks of speculations about potentially sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine? And could Trump now actually delay that decision?
Well, that's obviously, as they say in the United States, Sofia, the $64,000 question. Yes, I mean, it is a bit like if you're sort of planning a picnic and you're forecasting that it's going to be a nice sunny day with no clouds in the sky, and you wake up the next morning and you see it's pouring with rain, but you could still go ahead, of course, and have your picnic because you plan to do this. I think the first thing is that relations between Zelensky and Trump are much better than they were last February. Their recent meeting in the White House was much more cordial. The meeting in the Vatican after the death of the Pope, much more cordial. Zelensky has learned a lot about how to handle Trump, and he's received a lot of support, a lot of guidance, a lot of advice from the European leaders, and Trump has been more favorable in describing Zelensky lately. So in other words, they're in a better place than they were last February. Of course, as I said, it's not welcome news for Zelensky because, what's he hoping to do is not only to get a commitment on the Tomahawks in sufficient quantity and quickly, but also, of course, the Typhoon. These are the launchers of the Tomahawk, because if the Americans don't give the Ukrainians the launchers of the Tomahawk, simply giving them the missiles, which are normally fired from naval ships, is not going to be of much use. But he's also looking, as I mentioned earlier, Sofia, for this $90 billion package, which includes, ammunition, air defense systems, more Patriot systems, and he's also looking for more American industrial investment in Ukrainian defense industries. The Prime Minister, the head of the Ukraine Security Council, have been in Washington ahead of the Zelensky summit with Trump this week. They've been to Lockheed Martin, they've been to Raytheon, they've signed an agreement with Bell Aviation to get more American defense industries involved in production in Ukraine. That's very important and very significant. So Zelensky has got, a shopping list of various things. And I suppose from his perspective, and speaking, from my perspective, as a supporter of Ukraine, we have to hope, that sort of agreement, particularly the agreement on America buying Ukrainian drones, which has been negotiated for some time and which could produce significant income for Ukraine to buy more American weapons. We just have to hope that, these different things will not be derailed. On Tomahawks, it was always a bit of an open question because Trump has sort of dangled tomahawks, but always making it clear that he hasn't yet made a decision. And I think for Zelensky, the key thing will be to get a decision from Trump in order to keep the pressure up on Putin. Because let's face it, Putin uses similar long-range cruise missiles against Ukraine. So Russia has already escalated in that department. And of course, we know that it's now the Tomahawks that are putting Putin under pressure. So even if there's no immediate delivery of Tomahawks, the key thing I think for Zelensky is not seeing Trump publicly back away from this decision under pressure from Putin. I think that would be bad for deterrence, bad for Europe, and bad for Ukraine.
When we talk about Tomahawk missiles, some Western experts argue that they will not fundamentally change the course of the war. Do you agree? And how significant would they be compared to Ukraine's own systems like Flamingo missiles?
Well, again, that's a great question. I mean, if you look at all of the attacks in recent months that Ukraine has carried out on Russia's energy infrastructure, for example, a refinery in Saratov was hit by Ukraine yesterday. These have been incredibly successful. Russian energy production has gone down, oil production by 10%. There have been motorists queuing up outside petrol stations across Russia to get rationed stocks. Russia has cancelled a number of its oil and gas exports because it needs to divert those resources to the domestic market. This is hitting the Russian war machine hard, but it's also hitting the Russian income stream, preventing Russia getting money from its sales on international markets. So this has been a brilliantly successful tactic. And yes, Ukraine has done it with its own missiles like the Flamingo and many others, not European missiles or American missiles. But the Tomahawks, maybe not a war winner, but they certainly are something that will really increase the pressure if used on Russia because of their long range, longer ranges than what Ukraine has at the moment. They're extremely accurate as well, and they can hit, those targets deeper into Russia, particularly those drone factories, those air bases, for example, in Siberia, the Russians use for their war effort. So in wars, nothing is really a war winner. But if you can, increase the pressure by 10 or 15%, you can push Putin to the negotiating table, this time being Syria. So, because they're not war winners does not mean they're not significant and does not mean that they're not an option that should be pursued.
And my last question about so-called Ukraine Victory Fund, media is reported that the US now is working on this Ukraine Victory Fund, and it will be financed through new tariffs on China. From your perspective, is it a serious commitment or more just like a political gesture?
Well, of course, it's in the United States' interest because a lot of that fund will also be sourced from that minerals deal that we had earlier in the year signed between Kyiv and the United States, which was also an important factor, of course, in improving the relations as well. So the United States have got an interest in this fund because clearly it will also benefit those American companies that invest in Ukraine after the conflict, particularly in the minerals and in the energy sector. The fact that Trump is talking about sourcing this from China is also a sign that he recognizes that China has become a major facilitator of the Russian war effort. We had alarming news earlier this week that China is now even giving Russia satellite intelligence information on potential targets in the Ukrainian infrastructure sector. I mean, that's gone beyond passive cooperation like finance or electronics components or civilian drone technology to a much more active cooperation. And I think China has to be called out and made to pay a price for this activity, which is simply increasing the suffering of Ukrainians and prolonging the war. But I think that on the other hand, it's also very, very important that in terms of this fund, the Americans look to sourcing this from seizing frozen Russian assets, particularly those central bank assets that are currently being discussed in the European Union, by taking action against the Russian cryptocurrency market, which is now being also used as a source of revenue, putting more pressure on the Russian shadow fleet of tankers, and doing something which the Americans have not agreed to yet. I mean, in the G7, all G7 members except the United States have agreed to lower the Russian oil price for exports to $47 a barrel, to deprive Russia of revenue. The United States has not yet gone along with this. And so, yes, it's okay, to look to try to get the money from China, but it's even more urgent to get the money by putting more economic pressure on the Russian economy.
Thanks very much for this conversation and for your perspective and your thoughts.
As always, Sofia, I'm delighted for the invitation and I'm very grateful for it. Thank you very much. And everybody, yourself and all of your collaborators, please stay safe.